He was a billionaire who believed Christmas could be canceled like a meeting. Then, one wrong message arrived. One photo. A baby wrapped in Christmas lights. He thought it was a mistake, maybe a prank. But following that image led him to a truth he never saw coming. Before we go any further, take a breath with me. Wherever you're watching from tonight, I hope this story finds you open, curious, and willing to feel. These moments we share here aren't just about drama. They're about reflection, connection, and the quiet hope that people can still choose better. If this space feels safe to you, leave a kind word in the comments. Stories grow stronger when hearts show up together. Victor Hawley believed Christmas was a controllable variable. Flights could be delayed, staff replaced, emotions postponed. Nothing truly unexpected happened in his world unless he allowed it to. That certainty cracked at 6:14 p.m. when a single message slipped past his filters and landed on his phone while he was approving champagne selections for a holiday escape he'd planned to the minute. He didn't recognize the number, no name, no greeting. Just an image that loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, like it wanted him to sit with it longer than he intended. A baby lay on a narrow couch, bundled in a knitted blanket, tiny fists peeking out. Christmas lights were wrapped loosely around the child, not decorative, more improvised, glowing softly against pale fabric. The room behind was modest, worn armrest, a coffee table with a chipped corner. Nothing staged, nothing dramatic. And yet Victor felt an odd pressure settle behind his eyes. Who sent that? He muttered, more annoyed than curious, tapping the screen as if the phone owed him an explanation. Across the suite, the city lights reflected off floor-to-ceiling windows, glass and steel stretching into the winter dusk. His assistant hovered nearby with a tablet, waiting for confirmation on the canceled caviar shipment. Victor didn't look up. He zoomed in on the photo instead, jaw tightening when he noticed the baby's eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were focused somewhere else, wide and alert, as if tracking a voice just out of frame. "It's nothing," he said aloud, to no one in particular. "A prank, maybe, or a wrong number." It happened. He typed a curt reply. "Who is this?" No response came back. The mistress he'd planned to spend Christmas with emerged from the bedroom, already in a silk robe, hair pinned just right. "Everything okay?" she asked lightly, already smiling, already certain the answer would be yes. Victor locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Fine," he said. "Just logistics." But the word logistics rang hollow even to him. They'd called it a canceled holiday, but in truth, it was more like a detonation. Within minutes, Victor reversed bookings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Flights grounded. Staff dismissed with clipped apologies. His assistant stared at him, confused but obedient, as Victor paced the room, phone back in his hand, the mysterious baby photo now burning through his pocket like a live wire. "What's wrong?" The woman asked again, her voice sharper now, sensing the shift. "I said it's handled," he snapped, immediately regretting the edge, but not correcting it. He didn't want comfort. He wanted distance. Alone at last, Victor poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat, staring at the dark reflection of the glass. He reopened the image. This time, he studied the background. A crooked picture frame on the wall. A radiator beneath the window. A faded rug pattern he almost recognized. His chest tightened, and he frowned, irritated at the physical reaction. He hadn't felt nostalgia in years. He buried it under acquisitions and clean lines and better lighting. The baby's face held him. There was nothing extraordinary about it. No dramatic expression. Just a calm alertness that felt misplaced, like a memory wearing a stranger's skin. Victor scrolled back and forth, then checked the file details. The photo wasn't recent. Not today. Not even this month. His grip tightened. "Why now?" he whispered. He tried calling the number. It rang once, then disconnected. He tried again, straight to silence. He considered handing it off to security, to have it traced, erased, forgotten. That was the easy path, the usual path. Instead, he stood abruptly and pulled on his coat. Outside, winter air bit through his collar as he drove himself through streets he rarely touched anymore. The city shifted around him, polished towers giving way to older brick, holiday lights uneven and earnest. His navigation app recalculated twice before he turned it off completely. He didn't need directions. That realization unsettled him more than the photo ad. He slowed near a row of buildings with narrow stoops and mismatched wreaths. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Victor parked and sat there longer than he meant to, engine ticking softly, heart beating harder than necessary. He pulled the phone out again and looked at the image one more time. The baby's blanket was folded the way someone careful had done it. Not rich, not careless. Intentional. The Christmas lights weren't pretty, but they were warm. Someone had wrapped them gently, mindful of skin and comfort. That wasn't a prank. That was care. Victor swallowed, a feeling he didn't have a name for climbing his throat. He had built his life around distance, around insulation. And yet this one wrong photo had slipped through everything. The millionaire Christmas he'd designed so precisely lay in pieces behind him, and ahead was a street he hadn't walked in decades. He stepped out of the car, cold seeping through the soles of his shoes, and stared up at the buildings until one window caught his eye. For just a second, he thought he saw movement behind the thin curtain. Then nothing. His phone vibrated once. Not a message. Just the screen lighting up with the same image, as if reminding him it wasn't going anywhere. Victor exhaled slowly, realizing with a quiet dread that this wasn't a mistake meant to be fixed. It was an invitation he couldn't refuse, tied to a secret past he'd never fully buried, and whatever waited at the end of this trail was already reshaping his idea of control. He didn't know it yet, but the canceled holiday was the smallest thing he was about to lose. Victor Hawley woke before dawn with the uncomfortable sensation that something had already gone wrong without his permission. The suite was too quiet, a kind of silence that pressed against his ears instead of soothing them. For a moment, he forgot why his chest felt tight. Then the image returned uninvited. The baby, the Christmas lights, the couch that didn't belong in his present life. He sat up abruptly, rubbed his face, and reached for his phone before he was fully awake. The photo was still there. No follow-up message. No explanation. Just the same mysterious baby photo sitting at the top of his screen like it had claimed residency. Victor scrolled through his inbox, half expecting an apology or a threat, something that would make this make sense. There was nothing. Just business emails, flight confirmations that no longer mattered, and one short message from his assistant asking if the canceled holiday was final. Yes, Victor typed, his thumb striking the screen harder than necessary. Everything is canceled. He stood and paced the room, bare feet cold against polished stone. Control had always been his strongest currency. He didn't react. He calculated. He didn't panic. He planned. But now, irritation crept under his skin, sharp and persistent. He enlarged the photo again, zooming into the background, scanning for anything useful. The coffee table, the lamp, a folded blanket draped with care. It wasn't a setup, no ransom demand, no watermark, no angle meant to intimidate. Curiosity is expensive, he muttered, though he couldn't stop himself. Victor checked the metadata more thoroughly this time. The image hadn't been taken recently, but it also wasn't old enough to be dismissed. Weeks, maybe a few months. He frowned. If someone wanted to blackmail him, why wait? If it was a mistake, why hadn't the sender corrected it? The lack of urgency unsettled him. Whoever sent it didn't seem to want anything. They wanted him to look. His phone rang. His assistant, sounding cautious now. Sir, people are asking questions. About Christmas. about why everything was shut down so suddenly. Tell them I changed my mind, Victor snapped. That's all they need to know. There was a pause. And the guest? Victor closed his eyes briefly. She's no longer relevant. He ended the call and leaned against the window, watching the city wake up below. Somewhere out there, people were stringing lights, buying gifts, planning dinners that didn't require security clearance. He felt oddly disconnected from it all, like he'd stepped outside his own life without warning. The millionaire Christmas he'd always controlled with money and precision had dissolved overnight, replaced by a canceled holiday he couldn't explain even to himself. He tried the number again. This time, it went straight to an automated message saying it was no longer in service. Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. Disposable. Intentional. That detail bothered him more than any threat would have. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure there could be no easy answers. By mid-morning, Victor was driving again, retracing the route from the night before, this time with purpose. He didn't park immediately. He circled the block twice, watching people come and go, noting who belonged and who didn't. A woman carrying groceries. A man shoveling a narrow walkway. A child tugging at a mitten, laughing when it slipped off. Ordinary moments, stitched together with a warmth his penthouse never held. He stopped near the same building and sat there, engine idling, eyes fixed on the second-floor window. The curtains were drawn now. No movement. Victor's jaw tightened. He didn't like being observed without knowing by whom. A sensation crawled up his spine, turning curiosity into something closer to fear. Get a grip, he told himself, fingers tapping the steering wheel. It's just a picture. But it wasn't just a picture. It was a reminder. And reminders had a way of reopening doors you'd locked for a reason. Victor's thoughts drifted to a winter he rarely acknowledged, a time before his name meant anything, when mistakes had consequences instead of legal buffers. He pushed the memory away, but it pushed back harder, dragging with it the echo of a conversation he'd never finished, a choice he'd framed as necessary at the time. His phone buzzed with a message from a private investigator he trusted. A simple acknowledgement, looking into it. No promises. Victor slipped the phone back into his coat, unsatisfied. He didn't want to report. He wanted certainty. And certainty was slipping through his fingers, replaced by questions he'd built his entire life to avoid. He stepped out of the car at last, cold air cutting through his coat. The building smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. As he stood there, debating whether to knock or retreat, a door opened across the street. A woman stepped out, pausing when she noticed him. Their eyes met briefly. Her expression didn't shift. No surprise. No fear. Just recognition, as if she'd been expecting him to show up eventually. Victor's pulse jumped. He took a step forward, then stopped. The woman turned and walked away, unhurried, leaving him standing there with the weight of a hidden truth pressing down on his chest. He didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he returned to his car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at his hands. They were steady, but he felt anything but. The hidden truth tied to that baby, that secret past he'd buried under contracts and success, was no longer content to stay buried. Victor started the engine and drove away, knowing with a certainty that unsettled him more than anger ever had that this wasn't over. The mysterious baby photo had done its job. It had cracked something open, and whatever waited on the other side was already rearranging his life, whether he was ready or not. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you were in Victor's place, would you ignore that photo or follow it, no matter the cost? Drop your answer in the comments, give this story a like, subscribe to the channel, and rate it so far from 0 to 10. Your support keeps stories like this alive until the very end. By the third day, Victor Halle stopped pretending this was about control. Control implied choice, and whatever was pulling him back into that part of the city didn't feel optional anymore. It felt like gravity. The cancelled holiday had already become background noise, a footnote in conversations he ignored, while his focus narrowed to one thing, the place that shouldn't have mattered and somehow did. He drove there again in the late afternoon, when the sky was dull and colorless, the kind of winter light that flattened everything and made memories easier to mistake for the present. He parked farther away this time, not out of caution, but instinct. The neighborhood didn't announce itself as dangerous or dramatic. It was quiet in a way that suggested routine. Holiday decorations hung unevenly from porches, lights blinking out of sync, wreaths handmade instead of curated. Victor stepped onto the sidewalk and felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, like his body had recognized the terrain before his mind allowed it. Each step brought back fragments he hadn't invited. The smell of old brick after rain, the hum of a radiator working too hard, the memory of laughter that didn't echo because it never had room to. He told himself it was coincidence, that cities reused patterns the way people reused excuses, but the farther he walked, the more certain he became that this wasn't a place he'd stumbled into. This was somewhere he'd left behind deliberately. He stopped in front of the building from the photo. Up close, it looked smaller than he remembered, its paint chipped, its front steps worn down by decades of use. Victor stared at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. It didn't. Instead, the sound of a window sliding shut somewhere above made his shoulders tense. "You don't belong here anymore," he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. He turned to leave and nearly collided with an older man carrying a box of donated toys. The man steadied himself and nodded politely. "You looking for someone?" he asked, casual, curious. Victor shook his head. "No, just got turned around." The man smiled faintly. "Happens. This area does that to people." Victor watched him go, unsettled by how accurate the comment felt. As he walked back toward his car, his phone vibrated. Not a call, not a message. Just the screen lighting up again, displaying the same image of the baby wrapped in holiday lights. He stared at it longer this time, and looked up at the building once more. A woman stood in the doorway now. She hadn't been there seconds ago. She was watching him without trying to hide it. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. Victor recognized her instantly, though he hadn't seen her in years. Time had changed her hair, lined her face, but not the way she held herself. That hadn't softened. Their gazes locked. Neither of them smiled. For a moment, Victor considered pretending he didn't know her, walking past like a stranger. He had perfected that skill over the years. But something about the way she watched him made that impossible. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry. She looked like someone who had already accounted for this moment. "You're late," she said finally, her voice steady. Victor swallowed. "I didn't know I was expected." She tilted her head slightly. "You were always good at telling yourself that." The words landed harder than he expected. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Did you send the photo?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped aside, opening the door just enough to reveal a narrow hallway behind her. Warm light spilled out, soft and yellow, nothing like the cold gray outside. Victor hesitated. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly. "I just want to understand." The woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Understanding usually comes after you stop pretending," she said. "Come in, or don't. That part's still up to you." Victor crossed the threshold before he could talk himself out of it. The hallway smelled like clean laundry and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon, ordinary, disarming. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Inside, the space was small but carefully kept. Not decorated to impress, but to function. Victor noticed the couch immediately. It was the same one from the photo. He glanced toward it, then forced himself to look away. "You didn't come here to accuse me," he said, breaking the silence. So why now? The woman turned to face him fully. Because time ran out. For what? She crossed her arms, not defensively, but protectively. For pretending the past doesn't grow teeth. Victor exhaled slowly. He hadn't planned for this conversation, and yet every word felt inevitable. I didn't abandon anyone, he said, though the sentence sounded weak even to him. I made choices, difficult ones. Her eyes didn't soften. You disappeared, she replied, and you told yourself a story that made it easier to live with. A faint sound came from the next room. Not a cry, just a small, content noise. Victor's breath caught. You don't get to see the baby, she said immediately, reading his reaction. Not yet. I wasn't asking, he said, though his voice betrayed him. She studied him again, then sighed. Good, because asking comes later. The weight of the moment settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Victor realized then that this place, this woman, this life he'd avoided, wasn't here to punish him. It was here to confront him with something worse. The truth that leaving had never erased his responsibility. It had only delayed it. As he turned toward the door, preparing to leave before the walls closed in completely, she spoke again. You can walk away, she said calmly. You've always been good at that. But the photo wasn't a mistake, Victor. It was a reminder. One you needed before Christmas. He paused, hand on the doorframe. Why? Her answer came without hesitation. Because some secrets don't stay buried forever. And this one already knows your name. Victor stepped back into the cold evening air, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Behind him, the door closed gently, leaving him alone with the knowledge that the familiar place he'd sworn he'd forgotten was no longer willing to forget him. And somewhere inside that modest apartment, a truth waited patiently, growing stronger with every second he tried not to face it. Victor didn't expect to be invited back, and yet 2 evenings later, he found himself standing in the same narrow hallway again, coat in hand, heart beating faster than it should have for a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. This time, the door opened before he knocked. Eleanor Brooks stepped aside without a word, her expression neutral, as if his return had already been penciled into her schedule. You came back, she said, not surprised. I said I wanted to understand, Victor replied, lowering his voice as he stepped inside. That hasn't changed. Eleanor closed the door and gestured toward the living room. The space looked the same as before, calm and lived in, the kind of place where routines mattered more than appearances. Victor noticed the small details again. Shoes neatly lined by the wall, a stack of children's books on the coffee table, a folded blanket on the arm of the couch, placed there with intention, not decoration. You're used to answers that come with paperwork, Eleanor said as she moved toward the kitchen. This won't be like that. I figured, Victor replied. Nothing about this has been. She poured 2 cups of tea without asking what he wanted, then handed one to him. Victor accepted it automatically, more unsettled by the normalcy than anything else. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching but not breaking. You still haven't told me why you sent the photo, he said finally. Eleanor met his gaze. I didn't send it to accuse you, and I didn't send it to scare you. Then why? Victor pressed. Because you'd stopped looking, she said simply. And someone needed to remind you that ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. Victor leaned back, exhaling slowly. You could have reached out years ago. I could have, she agreed. But I didn't need anything from you then. I still don't. That landed harder than any accusation would have. Victor frowned. You expect me to believe this is all coincidence? Eleanor's mouth curved into a faint, humorless smile. You always thought if someone spoke to you, they wanted something. That's how your world works. Mine doesn't. He shifted in his seat. Then what do you want now? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked toward the doorway, leading deeper into the apartment. Victor tensed instinctively. Relax, she said, glancing back at him. "I told you, not yet." A soft sound drifted from the other room, not a cry. Just a small rhythmic noise, like contentment made audible. Victor's grip tightened around the cup. "You're careful," he said quietly. "Everything here is intentional. You learn to be," Eleanor replied, "when you don't have the luxury of mistakes." Victor studied her face. There was no resentment there. No bitterness. Just resolve. "Why didn't you ever ask for help?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Eleanor stopped and turned. "Because help that comes with conditions isn't help. It's leverage." The words settled heavily between them. Victor recognized the language immediately. It was the same logic he'd used his entire career, reframed without the gloss. "I didn't plan for things to end the way they did," he said, though the defense sounded thin. "No one ever does," Eleanor replied. "But you planned not to look back. That part was deliberate." Silence fell again. Victor realized then that Eleanor wasn't here to rewrite history. She wasn't interested in apologies or explanations. She was standing firmly in the present, grounded in choices she'd already made. "You left," she continued calmly. "Life kept going. It always does. You just weren't part of it." Victor swallowed. "And the baby?" Eleanor's gaze sharpened, but she didn't raise her voice. "The baby is not a bargaining chip, not a symbol, and not something you get access to just because you showed up." "I'm not trying to buy my way in," Victor said quickly. "I know," she replied. "That's new for you." Her honesty stung more than she probably intended. Victor set the tea down, untouched. "Then tell me what I'm supposed to do." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something internally. "You don't do anything yet," she said. "You sit with the discomfort. You let it exist without trying to solve it." "That's not how I operate," Victor said. She nodded. "Exactly." Another small sound came from the other room, closer this time. Victor's chest tightened again, a strange mix of fear and something else he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor noticed. "You feel it," she said quietly. "That pull, that's not guilt. It's recognition." He looked up at her. "Recognition of what?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "You don't get to rewrite the past, Victor. But you do get to decide who you're standing in the doorway of the future." He stood slowly, unsure whether he was being dismissed or spared. "You're not asking me to leave." "I'm not asking you to stay either," Eleanor replied. "This isn't about permission." As he moved toward the door, Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer now. "I didn't send the photo to find you," she repeated. "I sent it so you'd stop running." Victor paused, his hand hovering over the handle. For the first time since the mysterious baby photo had arrived, he understood that whatever was unfolding wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about consequence. And consequences, unlike deals, didn't care how powerful you were. He stepped out into the cold night, the door closing gently behind him, knowing with a certainty that unsettled him deeply that the woman who never asked for anything had just changed the trajectory of his life without demanding a single thing in return. The message arrived without warning, without apology, and without any attempt to soften its impact. Victor was sitting through a meeting he no longer cared about, listening to voices blur together while his attention drifted elsewhere, when his phone vibrated once against the table. "Come by at 6. That was all Eleanor wrote. No explanation, no reassurance, no hint of what waited for him on the other side of that door. Victor stared at the screen longer than necessary, aware of how quickly his pulse had changed pace. He excused himself mid-sentence, ignoring the confused looks that followed, and left the building without tying up a single loose end. For the first time in years, money, schedules, and reputation felt distant, like props from a life he was temporarily stepping out of. The drive across town felt longer than before. Traffic lights blurred together, and every red light gave him too much time to think. He replayed fragments of the last visit over and over. Eleanor's steady voice, the warmth inside the apartment, the sound from the next room he hadn't been allowed to see. He told himself he was prepared, that he'd built an entire career on walking into unknown rooms without flinching. But this wasn't a boardroom. There were no contracts here, no leverage, no exit clauses. Eleanor opened the door exactly at 6. She looked the same as always, composed, unreadable. "You have a little time," she said, stepping aside. "Not a lot. And you don't get to perform." "I wouldn't know how," Victor replied quietly. She gave him a look that suggested she wasn't convinced, then closed the door behind him. The apartment felt different immediately. Not just familiar now, but alive. The air carried warmth, the faint scent of soap, milk, and something freshly cooked. Ordinary things, disarming things. Victor stood near the entryway, unsure where to place his coat, his hands, his attention. He felt suddenly oversized, intrusive, like a guest who had arrived too early or too late. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the living room. "You don't need to stand like you're waiting for permission." Victor moved slowly, his gaze drifting ahead of him, and then he saw the baby. She lay on the couch, not asleep, not restless, just awake in that quiet, observant way that made the room feel smaller. No Christmas lights this time, no dramatic framing. Just a soft blanket with tiny stitched stars and a child who seemed entirely at ease in her own presence. Victor stopped walking. His breath caught without his consent, and for a moment, he forgot how to continue. The baby's eyes found him almost immediately. Not startled, not curious in the way adults were, just focused. Victor felt something shift inside his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a room he hadn't entered in years, suddenly unlocking itself. "Don't hover," Eleanor said from behind him, her voice calm. "Sit or leave. But don't loom." He sat on the edge of the chair opposite the couch, posture stiff, hands resting awkwardly on his knees. The baby studied him, unblinking. Victor had faced hostile investors, aggressive rivals, and public scrutiny without hesitation. But this quiet attention made his skin prickle. He wasn't being evaluated. He was being noticed. "She's calm," he said softly, the observation slipping out before he could censor it. "She usually is," Eleanor replied. "She decides what deserves her energy." Victor nodded, though the comment unsettled him more than it should have. The baby shifted slightly, one small hand emerging from the blanket. Victor watched the movement, heart pounding, unsure whether he was allowed to respond. Eleanor didn't stop him, so he leaned forward slowly and offered a single finger. The baby's grip closed around it instantly. Firm, certain, the contact sent a sharp, grounding sensation through him, and his throat tightened without warning. He hadn't been touched like this in years. Not without expectation, not without cost. This touch asked for nothing and gave nothing back, and that terrified him more than rejection ever had. He swallowed hard. "She's strong," he murmured. "She knows what she wants," Eleanor said. A baby made a small sound, something between a sigh and a hum, and Victor felt his chest ache. He watched her breathing, the steady rise and fall, the way her fingers relaxed and tightened again as if testing the world. Details began to register against his will. The shape of her mouth, the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated, a tiny mark near her collarbone, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Victor froze. "That's," his voice faltered. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the mark. "That's nothing." Eleanor said nothing. Memories surfaced without permission. A hospital room years ago. Fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant. Papers slid across a table by someone who spoke quickly and avoided eye contact. It's routine, he'd been told. Just a precaution. Just in case. Victor had signed without reading, eager to be done with a chapter he didn't want to examine too closely. I remember a winter, he said slowly, his voice lower now. I remember thinking I was doing the responsible thing by not staying. Eleanor finally looked at him. Responsible to who? Victor didn't answer. The baby released his finger and stretched, completely unconcerned with the tension filling the room. She yawned, eyes fluttering briefly, then settled again. The simplicity of it broke something in him. No drama, no accusation. Just existence. You don't get to decide what this means yet, Eleanor said quietly, reading his expression. Not today, Victor nodded, though his mind raced. He felt fear now, real fear, sharp and clarifying. Not fear of exposure or loss, but fear of truth. Fear that everything he'd buried had roots, and those roots had grown into something alive. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, he admitted. That's honest, Eleanor replied. It's a start. She glanced at the clock. Time. Victor stood slowly, reluctant in a way that surprised him. He looked at the baby one last time. She watched him with the same calm focus as before, as if memorizing him, as if he mattered whether he liked it or not. What happens next? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor met his gaze. Next, you decide whether you're ready to ask the question you're avoiding. The question pressed against his ribs, heavy and fully formed. He couldn't say it yet, not without unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. Victor stepped back into the cold evening air, the door closing softly behind him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached his car. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the dashboard, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of something irreversible settle into place. The child inside that apartment had changed the air in the room. And now, she had changed the air inside him too. Victor didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark of his penthouse, staring at a ceiling he'd paid an absurd amount to have custom finished, listening to the distant hum of a city that never seemed to pause long enough to feel anything. The image of the baby returned again and again, not as a photograph now, but as a presence. The steady gaze, the small hand closing around his finger, the mark near her collarbone he hadn't been able to unsee. By morning, exhaustion pressed behind his eyes, but clarity, unwelcome and sharp, had settled into his bones. He didn't call Eleanor. He didn't ask permission. He simply showed up. The sky was low and gray when he parked in front of the building, the air heavy with the promise of snow. He stood on the sidewalk, longer than necessary, hands buried in his coat pockets, breathing slowly as if bracing himself against impact. When the door opened, Eleanor didn't look surprised. She stepped aside without a word, and this time, Victor didn't hesitate. "You're early," she said quietly as she closed the door. "I didn't come to visit," Victor replied. "I came to listen." That made her pause. She studied him for a long moment, as if recalibrating. "Then sit," she said finally. "And don't interrupt." They sat at the small dining table, the same one Eleanor likely used for every meal, every bill, every quiet decision. There was no tea this time, no softening gestures. Just truth, laid bare without ceremony. "You left," Eleanor began, her voice even. "Not dramatically, not angrily. You just vanished. One day you were there, making promises you didn't fully believe in. The next, you were gone. No calls, no letters, no explanations that mattered." Victor nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. That alone felt like a confession. "I didn't chase you," she continued. "I didn't beg. I had responsibilities. I had a life that didn't pause because yours moved on. And when I realized I was pregnant, I didn't tell you." His breath hitched, sharp and involuntary. He lowered his gaze to the table, fingers curling against the wood. "I didn't tell you because I already knew who you were becoming," Eleanor said. "And I refused to let a child grow up feeling like an inconvenience." Victor closed his eyes. "I would have helped," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. That was the problem. The words landed with surgical precision. Victor looked up, confusion flickering across his face. You would have helped with money, Eleanor continued. With distance. With conditions you didn't even realize you were setting. And I wasn't willing to trade peace for comfort. Silence filled the room. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing against wet pavement. Victor swallowed hard. I told myself I was doing the right thing back then, he said. I told myself leaving was better than staying halfway. And I told myself the truth, Eleanor replied. That staying alone was better than being abandoned slowly. She stood and walked toward the living room. Victor followed, heart pounding, and this time, she didn't stop him when he looked toward the couch. The baby was asleep now, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, unaware of the weight of the conversation shaping her future. You don't get to fix this, Eleanor said softly. There's nothing to fix. There's only what is. Victor stared at the child, his chest tight. I didn't know, he said, the words fragile. I swear I didn't know. I believe you, Eleanor replied. That doesn't change the outcome. He nodded, the truth settling heavily. For the first time in his life, there was no deal to negotiate, no asset to leverage, no way to buy his way into absolution. The truth that cost more than money stood in front of him, small and sleeping, demanding nothing and offering everything. What do you want from me? Victor asked finally. Eleanor met his gaze. I want you to be honest, with yourself first. With her later, if that's something you earn. How do I earn it? He asked. She considered him for a moment. You start by not running, by showing up even when it's uncomfortable. By understanding that this isn't about guilt or redemption. It's about responsibility. Victor felt something shift inside him, something fragile and unfamiliar. And if I fail? Then you fail, Eleanor said simply. But at least you'll fail present. He nodded slowly, eyes returning to the sleeping child. Christmas loomed closer now, stripped of luxury and illusion, replaced by something quieter and infinitely heavier. Victor understood then that the canceled holiday wasn't a punishment. It was an opportunity, one he hadn't deserved but had been given anyway. As he turned to leave, Eleanor spoke again. The photo wasn't sent out of spite, she said. It was sent because I didn't want her first Christmas to be built on a lie. Victor paused at the door, the weight of that sentence settling into him. Outside, snow began to fall, light and hesitant, covering the city in a fragile layer of white. Victor stood there for a moment, letting it melt against his skin, knowing that the truth he'd finally faced had already changed him, whether he was ready or not. Victor returned 3 days later without announcing himself, without calling ahead, without any expectation of being welcomed. He parked farther down the block this time, letting the cold bite at his face as he walked, the city wrapped in that quiet anticipation that only came days before Christmas. Snow clung to rooftops and the edges of sidewalks, uneven and imperfect, already trampled by ordinary lives that didn't stop for reflection. He carried nothing with him except a small paper bag and a heaviness in his chest that no amount of money had ever prepared him for. Eleanor opened the door, took one look at him, then stepped aside. No greeting, no questions. Just a silent acknowledgement that showing up mattered more than words. Victor entered slowly, careful not to bring the cold in with him. The apartment hummed with low, steady life. A radio played softly somewhere in the background. The scent of something warm drifted from the kitchen, simple and grounding. I didn't come to stay long, Victor said quietly, as if volume itself could disrupt the fragile balance he felt around him. I just wanted to be useful. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the kitchen. The sink's broken, and the radiator in the back room keeps knocking like it's trying to escape. Victor blinked and almost smiled. I can fix those. I know, she replied. That's why I told you? He rolled up his sleeves without another word, and set to work. The tools were basic, mismatched, nothing like the polished equipment he kept in his own penthouse, mostly untouched. His hands moved more slowly than they used to, but the familiarity surprised him. Tighten, adjust, listen. For once, there was no rush, no audience. Just the quiet satisfaction of something broken, becoming less so. The baby watched him from her bouncer, wide-eyed and attentive. Victor felt her gaze, even when he didn't look directly at her, a steady presence that anchored him in the moment. Every now and then, she made a small sound, a soft gurgle or hum, and each one pulled him further out of his head and into the room. She likes routine, Eleanor said from the doorway. She notices when things change. Victor nodded. So do I, he admitted. By late afternoon, the radiator quieted, the sink stopped dripping, and Victor found himself sitting on the floor, back against the couch, exhausted in a way that felt earned. Eleanor handed him a mug of coffee without comment and sat across from him. You don't have to do this, she said, not unkindly. I know, Victor replied. That's why I am. Outside, children laughed as they dragged sleds across thin patches of snow. Somewhere down the block, someone struggled with a string of lights, cursing softly, then laughing at themselves. Victor listened, something loosening in his chest with every ordinary sound. Christmas used to be about escape for me, he said after a while. If I made it expensive enough, exclusive enough, it didn't have to mean anything. And now? Eleanor asked. He looked toward the baby, now half asleep, thumb tucked into her mouth. Now it feels different, heavier, but real. Eleanor nodded. Real tends to be. As evening settled in, Victor stayed. He helped prepare dinner, clumsy at first, then more confident under Eleanor's quiet guidance. There was no ceremony to it, no curated moment. Just two adults moving around each other, learning a rhythm that didn't require performance. When the baby grew fussy, Eleanor handed her to Victor without explanation. He froze, instinctively stiff, and adjusted, cradling her carefully. She'll tell you if you're doing it wrong, Eleanor said. The baby didn't cry. She settled against him, warm and solid, her breathing evening out as if she'd accepted his presence without needing justification. Victor felt his throat tighten, but he didn't look away this time. He let the moment exist without trying to frame it as something else. Dinner was simple. Soup, bread, laughter that surprised him when it happened. Victor found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, small ones, unpolished, about winters before money had insulated him from consequence. Eleanor listened without interrupting, without judgment. Later, when the baby was asleep and the apartment dimmed into quiet, Victor stood by the window, watching snow fall under the glow of streetlights. He realized then that Christmas had arrived without spectacle, without invitation. It hadn't been canceled. It had been redirected. I don't know what comes next, he said softly. Eleanor joined him, standing close, but not touching. Neither do I, that's okay. Victor nodded, understanding something fundamental at last. This wasn't redemption. It wasn't a dramatic turnaround or a public reckoning. It was consistency. It was choosing to show up again tomorrow, and the day after that, without guarantees. As he put on his coat to leave, the baby stirred softly, then settled again. Victor paused, hand on the door, and felt a quiet certainty settle into place. Whatever he'd been chasing all these years, whatever he thought Christmas was supposed to look like, it had never been about distance or excess. It had always been about staying. And this time, he intended to. Christmas morning arrived without spectacle, without announcements, without the kind of excess Victor Hawley had once considered essential. The city was quieter than usual, snow resting gently along sidewalks and rooftops, as if trying not to disturb anyone. Victor stood outside Eleanor's building longer than necessary, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands empty. No wrapped boxes, no expensive gestures. Just himself, standing still, something he hadn't learned to do until very recently. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Eleanor looked tired, not the exhaustion of sleepless nights alone, but the deeper kind that came from carrying responsibility without complaint. Still, there was calm in her posture, and something else too, something softer than before. She stepped aside without speaking, and Victor entered, closing the door gently behind him. The apartment felt different on Christmas morning. Quieter, warmer. The lights were dim. Not festive, just enough to soften the corners of the room. The baby lay on the couch, awake, wrapped carefully in a pale blanket, eyes open and alert. Victor felt the familiar pull in his chest, but now it came without panic. It felt steady, anchored. They sat at the small table, facing each other, neither rushing to fill the silence. Outside, distant laughter echoed faintly. Children somewhere discovering snow had fallen overnight. Victor listened, letting the sounds settle into him. "There's something you should know," Eleanor said at last, her voice calm but deliberate. Victor nodded. "I figured." She studied him for a moment. "No," she said gently. "You think you know." "That's different." He didn't argue. He waited. Eleanor folded her hands together. "The night I took that photo, I didn't plan on sending it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was sitting right there," she nodded toward the couch, "watching her sleep. And I realized something that scared me more than doing this alone ever had." Victor leaned forward slightly, listening. "I realized she was starting to resemble you in ways that had nothing to do with her face," Eleanor continued. "The way she watched the room before reacting. The way she went quiet when something didn't feel right. The way she studied people instead of reaching for them." Victor swallowed. "And I knew," Eleanor said, "that if you never saw her, truly saw her, you'd spend the rest of your life believing you left nothing behind. I couldn't let her first Christmas be built on a lie like that." Victor exhaled slowly, the truth settling in his chest with unexpected weight. "So the photo wasn't meant to punish me?" "No," Eleanor replied. "It was meant to wake you up." Victor nodded. "It did." She stood and walked toward the couch, lifting the baby carefully, her movements practiced and gentle. Without ceremony, without hesitation, she placed the child in Victor's arms. He froze for half a second, and instinct took over. The baby shifted, settled against him, her small hand gripping the fabric of his sweater. Victor felt his chest tighten, emotion rising faster than he could control. He didn't look away this time. "I didn't know you existed," he said softly, his voice unsteady. "And I can't undo that. I can't pretend I was anything but absent. But I know this now, and I'm here, not to claim anything, not to rewrite the past, just to be present, if that's something I'm allowed to earn." The baby made a quiet sound, something content, and rested her head against his chest. Victor closed his eyes, the weight of her grounding him completely. In that moment, the secret that had unraveled his carefully constructed life revealed itself fully. Not as a shocking revelation, not as a dramatic twist, but as a simple, undeniable truth that had been waiting patiently. Eleanor watched them, her expression unreadable at first, then subtly softer. "You don't become a father because of biology alone," she said quietly. "You become one through consistency, through showing up when it's inconvenient, when it's uncomfortable, when there's nothing in it for you." Victor nodded, eyes still fixed on the child. "I understand that now." They sat like that for a long time, the apartment wrapped in quiet. No photos were taken, no declarations made. This wasn't a moment meant for anyone else. It wasn't a story for the world. It was private, real. Later they sat on the floor, the baby between them, surrounded by nothing more than shared space and unspoken understanding. Eleanor spoke then, filling in pieces Victor hadn't asked for, but needed to hear. About nights spent alone. About choices made without resentment. about protecting peace at the cost of comfort. Victor listened without interrupting, without trying to soften the truth. "I never planned to hide her from you forever," Eleanor said. "But I needed to know who you were before I opened that door." "And now?" Victor asked quietly. "And now," she replied, "I see someone who finally understands that love isn't a transaction." Outside, church bells rang faintly, distant and imperfect. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed too loudly. Christmas existed beyond the walls of the apartment, but Victor realized it had already arrived exactly where it needed to. When it was time to leave, Victor stood slowly, reluctant but steady. Eleanor walked him to the door. "She'll see you again," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Victor nodded. "As often as you'll allow." Eleanor opened the door. "As often as you earn it." Victor stepped into the cold, snow beginning to fall again, light and unassuming. He paused on the steps, breathing deeply, feeling something unfamiliar settle into place. The secret that had once threatened to destroy his sense of control hadn't taken anything from him that mattered. It had given him something real. Christmas hadn't been canceled after all. It had simply become something else entirely.